A hungry child challenges a powerful man with a promise no one would dare to make, to heal him in exchange for leftover food. Mocked and dismissing the proposal, the millionaire had no idea the girl knew more about him than any expert. If you were touched by this beautiful story of resilience and love, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you're watching from. Continuing. The bitter November wind whipped through the narrow streets of South Boston, carrying with it the scent of impending snow. 4-year-old Lily Thompson pulled her threadbare jacket tighter around her tiny frame as she walked alongside her grandmother, Martha. The old woman's hands, weathered by decades of hard work, clutched a basket filled with herbs and homemade remedies she sold to make ends meet. "Remember, Lily," Martha said, her voice soft but firm, "we don't need much to be happy. Just enough." Lily nodded, her bright eyes taking in the changing landscape as they moved from their working-class neighborhood toward Beacon Hill, where elegant brownstones stood tall and proud, their windows gleaming in the afternoon sun. The contrast wasn't lost on the child, whose observation skills far exceeded her years. "Grandma, why do some people have so much, while others have so little?" Lily asked, a question that seemed too profound for a 4-year-old. Martha sighed. "Life isn't always fair, little one. But remember, true wealth isn't measured by what you have, but by who you are." As they turned onto a tree-lined street, Martha pointed to a magnificent mansion that stood apart from the others. Its massive iron gates and imposing stone facade made it look more like a fortress than a home. "That's where Mr. Blackwood lives," Martha explained. "We're delivering some herbs for his cook." Mr. Blackwood. Lily's curiosity was piqued. Richard Blackwood, one of the wealthiest men in Boston. "He owns half the real estate in this city," Martha replied, a hint of something unspoken in her tone. "But all his money can't fix his legs. He's been in a wheelchair for years." Lily's eyes widened. "He can't walk?" "No, child. The best doctors in the country have tried to help him, but nothing has worked." When they reached the service entrance, Martha was greeted by a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and flour-dusted hands. While the adults spoke, Lily's attention was drawn to the kitchen window, where she could see staff members discarding perfectly good food into trash bins. "Why are they throwing away all that food?" Lily asked, interrupting the conversation. The cook, Mrs. Jenkins, looked embarrassed. "Mr. Blackwood is very particular about his meals. If something isn't prepared exactly to his liking, he won't touch it, and he insists that leftovers be discarded immediately." Lily frowned, thinking of the empty cupboards at home and the watery soup that had been their dinner for 3 nights in a row. Something stirred within her, a sense of injustice but also determination. While Martha was busy discussing payment, Lily slipped away. With the fearlessness of a child who hadn't yet learned to be intimidated by wealth or status, she navigated through the mansion's service corridors. Staff members, assuming she belonged to one of the household employees, paid her little mind. She found herself in a grand hallway, lined with portraits of stern-faced men and women who shared Richard Blackwood's sharp jawline and piercing eyes. Following the sound of an irritated voice, Lily reached a magnificent study, where a man in an expensive wheelchair was berating a nervous assistant. "I don't care what Dr. Carter says. These new medications are useless, just like all the others. Get out and don't come back until you have something that actually works." The assistant scurried out, nearly bumping into Lily, who stood in the doorway, observing. Richard Blackwood turned his wheelchair sharply, his cold blue eyes landing on the small intruder. "Who the hell are you, and how did you get in here?" he demanded. Instead of cowering, Lily stepped forward. "I'm Lily Thompson. My grandma is delivering herbs to your kitchen." She tilted her head, studying him with an intensity that made Richard shift uncomfortably. "You're throwing away a lot of food," Richard scoffed. "And what business is that of yours, little girl?" "My family doesn't have enough food," Lily stated simply. "And you can't walk." "How observant," Richard replied sarcastically. "Now run along before I call security." But Lily stood her ground. "I can help you walk again." The statement hung in the air, so absurd that Richard was momentarily stunned into silence. Then he laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. "Oh, really? You? A child who can barely reach my desk? When the top neurologists and physical therapists in the world have failed, they don't see what I see," Lily said with unnerving calm. "And what exactly do you see, Miss Thompson?" Richard's voice dripped with condescension. "Your legs move when you're angry," Lily pointed out. Just now, when you were yelling, your right foot tapped 3 times. And yesterday, when you were watching the baseball game on your big TV, your legs tensed when your team almost scored. I saw through the window. Richard's face paled. You've been spying on me? Observing, Lily corrected. My grandma says there's a difference. Get out, Richard whispered, his hands gripping the armrests of his wheelchair so tightly his knuckles turned white. I'll make you a deal, Lily proposed, undeterred. Give me the food you throw away and I'll help you walk again. Richard stared at the child, torn between outrage at her audacity and a strange, unwelcome flicker of hope. Before he could respond, Martha appeared in the doorway, her expression a mixture of horror and apology. Lily, what are you doing? I'm so sorry, Mr. Blackwood. My granddaughter wandered off. Your granddaughter is trespassing and making ridiculous claims, Richard snapped. Martha quickly took Lily's hand. Please forgive us. We'll leave immediately. As Martha pulled her toward the door, Lily looked back at Richard. Your right hand trembles when you're lying, she said softly. And you're lying about not being able to walk. The words hit Richard like a physical blow. He opened his mouth to call for security, to have this presumptuous child and her grandmother thrown out and banned from his property forever. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was the certainty in those innocent eyes. Or maybe it was the fact that she'd noticed things about his condition that even his doctors had missed. Wait, he called out, surprising himself as much as Martha. Mrs. Thompson, isn't it? Bring your granddaughter back tomorrow at 3. And yes, you can take whatever food the kitchen was going to discard. Martha looked confused, but nodded cautiously. As you wish, Mr. Blackwood. As they left the mansion, their basket now filled with gourmet leftovers that would feed their family for days, Martha questioned Lily about what had happened. What did you say to that man, Lily? I've never seen Richard Blackwood change his mind about anything. Lily looked up at her grandmother, a small smile playing on her lips. I told him the truth, Grandma. Sometimes people forget what that sounds like. Martha studied her granddaughter with newfound wonder, recognizing the wisdom that seemed to flow through the child, the same wisdom that had run through generations of Thompson women, though never manifesting so young or so powerfully. Back in his study, Richard Blackwood stared out the window, watching the grandmother and child walk away. For the first time in years, he felt something other than bitterness and resignation. It wasn't exactly hope, he wasn't foolish enough for that, but it was curiosity. And perhaps, though he would never admit it, a tiny spark of fear that this strange child had seen through the carefully constructed facade that had fooled everyone else in his life. He pressed a button on his wheelchair, summoning his personal assistant. Find everything you can about the Thompsons, he ordered, particularly the child, Lily. I want to know who they are, where they come from, and what they're really after. What Richard Blackwood couldn't possibly know was that this chance encounter with a 4-year-old girl would set in motion events that would transform not only his life, but the lives of everyone connected to him. The wheels were already turning, much like those on his wheelchair. Only this time they were moving toward a destination he never could have anticipated. The following day, Martha hesitated at the service entrance of the Blackwood mansion, her weathered hand gripping Lily's small one tightly. I'm not sure about this, Lily, she whispered. Rich men like Mr. Blackwood don't invite people like us into their homes without a reason. Lily looked up at her grandmother, with those discerning eyes that seemed to hold centuries of wisdom. He needs help, Grandma, and we need food. Before Martha could respond, Mrs. Jenkins opened the door, her expression a mixture of curiosity and concern. Mr. Blackwood is waiting for you in the conservatory, she said, ushering them in. It's quite unusual. He rarely receives visitors there. The conservatory stood at the eastern wing of the mansion, a cathedral of glass and iron filled with exotic plants from around the world. Richard Blackwood sat in his wheelchair beside a small fountain, sunlight streaming through the glass ceiling, casting dappled shadows across his stern face. You're 3 minutes late, he said without looking up. We had to walk from South Boston, sir, Martha explained. The bus was delayed. Richard finally turned to them, his gaze lingering on Lily. Mrs. Thompson, I'd like to speak with your granddaughter alone. Martha stiffened. I don't think that's appropriate, Mr. Blackwood. Grandma, it's okay, Lily said, giving Martha's hand a reassuring squeeze. I'll be fine. Martha reluctantly agreed to wait in the kitchen with Mrs. Jenkins, who promised tea and fresh scones. Once she was gone, Richard wheeled closer to Lily. So, little girl, you think you can make me walk again? His tone was mocking. but there was something else beneath it, a vulnerability he was trying desperately to hide. "I know I can," Lily replied simply. "And how exactly do you plan to accomplish this miracle? Do you have a medical degree I'm unaware of?" Richard's sarcasm was as sharp as a scalpel. Lily walked around his wheelchair, examining it with interest. "Your problem isn't in your legs, it's in your mind." Richard's face flushed with anger. "That's absurd. I've had MRIs, CT scans, consultations with specialists from Johns Hopkins to the Mayo Clinic. The nerve damage is real." "Yes, there was damage," Lily agreed, surprising him with her perception. "But it healed. Your body is ready to walk. Your mind won't let it." "And what makes you a 4-year-old from the wrong side of town an expert on my condition?" Richard demanded. Lily shrugged. "I see things others don't. Like how you shift your weight when you're uncomfortable. How your legs tense when you're angry. The way your feet point in the direction you want to go." Richard fell silent, unsettled by her observations. "What do you want from me?" he finally asked, his voice uncharacteristically uncertain. "I told you yesterday, the food you throw away, and maybe some books for the shelter where my mum works." Richard studied her. He'd had his assistant dig into the Thompsons' background overnight. Emma Thompson, Lily's mother, worked double shifts at a women's shelter in South Boston. Martha Thompson was known in certain circles for her herbal remedies and so-called healing touch. And Lily, well, there wasn't much information about Lily, except that she'd tested off the charts in an early childhood development screening at her preschool. "Tell me about your family," Richard said, suddenly curious. "How long have you lived in Boston?" "The Thompsons have been here for generations," Lily replied. "My great-great-grandmother came to work for a wealthy family on Beacon Hill, the Blackwoods." Richard's eyebrows shot up. "That's impossible." "It's true. Grandma has old letters and photographs. Eleanor Thompson was a healer too. She helped the family when doctors couldn't." An uncomfortable feeling settled in Richard's stomach. There was something about this child that unnerved him, a sense that she knew more than she should. "Enough about your family history. If you're so confident in your abilities, how would you propose to heal me?" he challenged. "First, you need to admit the truth," Lily said. "About why you stay in that chair." Richard's hands gripped the armrests. "You have no idea what you're talking about." "You're scared," Lily continued, as if she hadn't heard him. "Something happened that made you afraid to stand on your own feet. Something to do with how you got your money." Richard's face drained of color. "Get out," he whispered. But Lily wasn't finished. "Your grandfather's company, the one that made all those chemicals, the ones that made people sick in the river towns. How could you possibly know about that?" Richard demanded, his voice shaking. "My grandma told me. Her sister got sick from the water, but your family said it wasn't their fault." Richard stared at the child, a cold feeling spreading through his chest. The Thompson lawsuit had been settled decades ago, buried under non-disclosure agreements and payoffs. It was a skeleton in the Blackwood closet that he'd assumed was long forgotten. "Your accident happened the day you found out," Lily continued, her young voice eerily calm. "The day you learned what your family had been hiding." Richard's breathing quickened. The car crash that had damaged his spine had indeed occurred the same day he'd discovered files in his grandfather's study, documents proving that Blackwood Chemical had known about the toxic effects of their waste products for years, but had continued dumping them into the Merrimack River. "You didn't want to be part of it anymore," Lily said softly. "So your body found a way to stop you from walking in their footsteps." The silence in the conservatory was broken only by the gentle splash of the fountain. Richard felt exposed, as if this child had peeled back his skin to reveal every secret he'd ever tried to hide. "You can leave now," he said, his voice barely audible. "Don't you want to get better?" Lily asked. "What I want," Richard replied, regaining some of his composure, "is for you to stop pretending you know anything about me or my family." "I can help you face it," Lily persisted. "All of it. Then your legs will remember how to work." Richard turned his wheelchair away from her, facing the fountain. "Mrs. Jenkins will give you some food to take home. Come back next week if you want more. But I don't want to hear any more of these theories." Lily studied him for a moment longer, then nodded. "Okay, Mr. Blackwood, but I'll be back. And next time, we'll try standing." After Lily and Martha left with bags of gourmet leftovers, Richard remained in the conservatory, his mind racing. He pressed the intercom button on his wheelchair. "Get Dr. Carter on the phone," he ordered his assistant. "Tell him it's urgent." An hour later, Dr. James Carter arrived at the mansion, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his designer suit impeccable. He'd been Richard's personal physician for years, managing his care and coordinating with specialists. "What's the emergency, Richard?" he asked, setting his medical bag on a nearby table. "There's a child," Richard began, struggling to keep his voice steady. "A 4-year-old girl who seems to know things she shouldn't. About my condition. About my family." Dr. Carter's expression remained professionally neutral, but Richard caught a flicker of concern in his eyes. "What kind of things?" "She says my paralysis is psychological, that my legs are physically healed." "Doctor," Carter shook his head. "That's ridiculous. We have years of medical documentation." "Documentation that you provided," Richard interrupted. "Tests that you arranged." An uncomfortable silence fell between them. Their relationship had always been more complex than doctor and patient. Dr. Carter had been on the Blackwood payroll for decades, first serving Richard's father, and now Richard himself. "What exactly are you implying, Richard?" Dr. Carter asked quietly. Richard held the doctor's gaze. "I'm not implying anything. I'm asking you directly. Is there any possibility that this child is right? Could I actually walk if I wanted to?" Dr. Carter adjusted his tie, a nervous habit Richard had noticed over the years. "The mind is a powerful thing, Richard, but your injury was severe. The damage to your spinal cord." "Just answer the question, James." Dr. Carter sighed. "There were anomalies in some of your tests over the years, responses that didn't align with complete paralysis. But given the trauma of the accident and your father's insistence on maintaining certain narratives about the family, we thought it best to focus on management rather than rehabilitation." Richard felt as if the air had been sucked from his lungs. "You knew all this time?" "We suspected," Dr. Carter corrected. "Nothing definitive. And your father was adamant that you be protected from any unnecessary stress." Protected. The word rang hollow in Richard's mind. His father hadn't been protecting him. He'd been protecting the Blackwood legacy. Keeping Richard dependent and controlled had ensured he wouldn't pursue questions about the company's past. "I want new tests," Richard demanded. "Independent evaluations. No Blackwood influence." Dr. Carter looked alarmed. "Richard, think about what you're saying. The implications for your father's estate, the trust fund conditions." "Get out," Richard said. The same words he'd spoken to Lily, but now filled with a different kind of resolution. "And don't come back." After Dr. Carter left, Richard wheeled himself to the window, watching as the doctor's Bentley disappeared down the driveway. The conversation with Lily had shaken loose something inside him, doubts that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. He turned his wheelchair toward his late father's study, a room he rarely entered. It was time to face some truths, starting with what really happened the day of his accident, and what his family had been hiding all these years. And perhaps most disturbing of all, he needed to understand how a 4-year-old girl from South Boston could possibly know things that had been buried in Blackwood secrets for generations. The Thompsons' modest apartment in South Boston was filled with the aroma of reheated gourmet food from the Blackwood mansion. Emma Thompson watched in disbelief as her daughter meticulously arranged roasted vegetables and prime rib on their chipped plates. "Mum, you should try this sauce," Lily said, carefully spooning béarnaise over the meat. "The chef makes it with fresh tarragon." Emma exchanged glances with Martha. "How does she even know what tarragon is?" she whispered. Martha shrugged, a knowing smile playing on her lips. "Our Lily has always been special." After dinner, while Emma worked on her online nursing courses, Martha took Lily to the small bedroom they shared. From beneath her bed, Martha pulled out a weathered cedar box, inlaid with intricate carvings. "It's time you learned more about our family, Lily," Martha said, her voice solemn. "About the gifts that run in our blood." Lily traced the patterns on the box with her small fingers. "Like seeing things others don't?" Martha nodded. "The Thompson women have always had the sight. Some call it intuition, others call it magic. I just call it knowing." She opened the box, revealing a collection of yellowed letters, photographs, and a small leather-bound journal. "This belonged to my grandmother, Eleanor Thompson. She worked for the Blackwoods in the early 1900s. Martha pulled out a sepia-toned photograph showing a stern-faced woman in a maid's uniform standing beside a much younger version of the portrait Lily had seen in Richard's hallway. "That's Eleanor," Martha explained, "and that's Jonathan Blackwood, Richard's grandfather. She was more than just a maid to that family. She was their healer when modern medicine failed them." Lily studied the photograph intently. "She looks like me." "Yes, she does," Martha agreed. "And like you, she could see right through people. Their pains, their secrets, their true natures. Martha hesitated, choosing her next words carefully. The Blackwoods didn't always appreciate her gifts, especially when she started asking questions about the factory. The chemical factory, Lily said, the one that made people sick. Martha's eyes widened slightly, surprised by Lily's knowledge. Yes. How did you know that? I saw it in Mr. Blackwood's eyes when I mentioned it, and in the water that runs beneath his house. Martha fell silent, regarding her granddaughter with a mixture of pride and concern. Lily's abilities were manifesting more powerfully than anyone in their family line had experienced. It was both a blessing and a burden. Lily, listen to me, Martha said, taking the child's hands in hers. What you can do, what you can see, it's special. But it can also be dangerous, especially when it threatens powerful people like the Blackwoods. Mr. Blackwood is scared, Lily observed. Not of me, of himself. Martha nodded slowly. That's often the case with people who carry heavy secrets. But be careful, little one. Even wounded animals can bite when cornered. Across town in the cavernous library of the Blackwood mansion, Richard was immersed in his own family history. He'd spent hours poring over old company records, board meeting minutes, and private correspondence that had been carefully preserved by generations of Blackwoods. The more he read, the more disturbed he became. Blackwood Chemical had indeed known about the toxic effects of their manufacturing process as early as 1972, almost 15 years before the official investigations began. Internal memos showed that his grandfather had ordered test results suppressed and whistleblowers silenced through a combination of bribes and threats. But what shook Richard to his core was finding his own father's involvement. Harold Blackwood had personally overseen the legal strategy that blamed the river contamination on other factories in the area, using the family's political connections to redirect investigations. Richard leaned back in his wheelchair, his head spinning with the implications. The Blackwood fortune, which he'd inherited and expanded, was built on a foundation of lies and suffering. The trust fund that had supported him since the accident came with invisible strings that perhaps had been holding him in this wheelchair all these years. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was a text from Dr. Carter. Richard, please reconsider. Some doors are best left closed for everyone's sake. Richard deleted the message without responding. Then he did something he hadn't done in years. He tried to stand. Gripping the arms of his wheelchair, he attempted to push himself upward. His legs trembled violently, and pain shot through muscles atrophied from disuse. He managed to rise barely an inch before collapsing back into the chair, sweat beading on his forehead. But that inch was enough. For the first time since the accident, Richard had intentionally moved his legs. The child was right. The paralysis wasn't complete. With renewed determination, Richard turned back to the documents spread across the library table. He needed to understand everything, not just about his family's crimes, but about the Thompson family as well. Who were these people, and how did they know so much about the Blackwoods' darkest secrets? His research led him to newspaper clippings from the 1980s about a class-action lawsuit against Blackwood Chemical. Among the plaintiffs listed was a Rose Thompson, sister of Martha Thompson. The case had been settled out of court with all records sealed by judicial order. Richard dug deeper, finding personnel files from the estate. Eleanor Thompson had worked for his grandfather from 1905 until 1923, when she was abruptly dismissed with a substantial severance payment. The reason for her termination was redacted, but a handwritten note in Jonathan Blackwood's journal provided a chilling clue. E.T. knows too much, claims the river will bring judgment on us all. Handled the situation permanently. The phrase "handled permanently" sent a shiver down Richard's spine. What had his grandfather done to Eleanor Thompson? And was it connected to the strange abilities her descendant Lily seemed to possess? Richard was so absorbed in his research that he didn't notice Mrs. Jenkins standing in the doorway until she cleared her throat. "Sir, Mr. Wilson from the family office is here. He says it's urgent." Richard sighed, hastily gathering the documents into a folder. Edward Wilson had been the Blackwood family's financial advisor for decades, managing their considerable investments with ruthless efficiency. "Send him in," Richard instructed, making sure the most damning evidence was hidden from view. Edward Wilson entered the library with the confident stride of a man accustomed to wielding power. In his 60s, with silver hair and penetrating grey eyes, he carried himself with an air of authority that even Richard found intimidating. "Richard," Wilson said, dispensing with formalities. I received a concerning call from James Carter this afternoon. Did you now? Richard kept his tone neutral. And what did the good doctor have to say? He mentioned you've been entertaining some unusual ideas about your condition, and that you've been visited by people asking questions about family history. Richard's jaw tightened. I wasn't aware that my personal affairs required your oversight, Edward. Wilson's expression didn't change, but his eyes hardened. The Blackwood Trust has specific provisions regarding your health status and management of family assets. Any significant change could trigger a re-evaluation of your position as trustee. The implied threat wasn't subtle. If Richard was no longer considered disabled, he could lose control of the family fortune. The trust had been structured that way by his father, allegedly to ensure Richard would always have the resources for his care, but in reality, to maintain the status quo. I'm simply exploring my family history, Richard said carefully. Surely that's within my rights. Some aspects of history are best left unexplored, Wilson replied, particularly when they involve settled legal matters. Like the Thompson lawsuit? A flicker of surprise crossed Wilson's face before he composed himself. That matter was resolved decades ago to everyone's satisfaction. Was it? Richard challenged. Or was it buried under non-disclosure agreements and payoffs? Wilson straightened his already impeccable tie. I'm concerned about you, Richard. This sudden interest in ancient history, these meetings with the Thompson family, it seems out of character. Perhaps you don't know my character as well as you think, Richard countered. Perhaps not, Wilson conceded. But I do know that the current arrangements have served the Blackwood interests well. Changes could be disruptive. The threat hung in the air between them. Richard had always known that his family's empire was built on more than just chemical patents and real estate investments, but he was only now beginning to understand the full extent of the corruption. Thank you for your concern, Edward, Richard said, his voice cold, but I can manage my own affairs. After Wilson left, Richard returned to the documents he'd been studying. His hands trembled, not from physical weakness, but from anger and resolve. The Blackwood legacy was poisoned, just like the river they had contaminated, and somehow a 4-year-old girl had sensed it all. Richard reached for his phone and made a call he never thought he would make. Boston General Hospital, a voice answered. How may I direct your call? Dr. Sarah Bennett, please, Richard requested. Tell her it's Richard Blackwood calling. Dr. Bennett was one of the few neurologists who had suggested Richard's paralysis might have a psychological component. His father had fired her immediately and ensured she would never work with the family again. But now Richard needed her expertise and her honesty. As he waited to be connected, Richard glanced at a photograph on his desk, a younger version of himself standing proudly next to his father at the opening of the Blackwood Medical Research Center. The irony wasn't lost on him that the center, funded by chemical profits, was dedicated to finding cures for the very diseases their factories had caused. Dr. Bennett speaking, a woman's voice came on the line. Dr. Bennett, this is Richard Blackwood. We met several years ago after my accident. A pause. Yes, Mr. Blackwood, I remember. Your father made your feelings about my diagnosis quite clear. Those weren't my feelings, Richard admitted, and I'm beginning to think you were right all along. Another pause, longer this time. What's changed? Richard took a deep breath. Everything, Doctor. And I need your help to understand why I've been living a lie for the past decade. As Richard began to explain his encounter with Lily Thompson, he felt something shifting inside him, not just physically, but emotionally. The walls he'd built around himself were cracking, letting in light that illuminated truths he'd been hiding from for years. What he didn't know was that across town, little Lily was already dreaming about their next meeting, seeing with perfect clarity the path that would lead Richard Blackwood out of his wheelchair and toward redemption, a path that would soon put both of them in the crosshairs of those determined to keep the Blackwood secrets buried forever. The following week, Lily skipped alongside Martha as they approached the Blackwood mansion for their scheduled visit. Unlike their previous encounters, this time they were directed to the main entrance, where a stern-faced butler ushered them into an elegant sitting room. Mr. Blackwood will join you shortly, the butler informed them before withdrawing. Martha nervously smoothed her worn dress, feeling out of place among the antique furniture and oil paintings, worth more than their entire apartment building. Lily, however, showed no such discomfort. She wandered around the room, examining objects with curious eyes. "Grandma, look," Lily said, pointing to a painting partially hidden behind heavy drapes. "It's her." Martha moved closer and gasped. The portrait showed a young woman with striking features similar to Lily's, dressed in early 20th century clothing. At the bottom of the ornate frame was a small plaque. "Eleanor Thompson, Household Healer, 1905-1923. "Why would they have a portrait of our Eleanor?" Martha whispered, bewildered. "Because she was important to them," came Richard's voice from the doorway. He wheeled himself into the room, accompanied by a tall woman with short auburn hair and intelligent eyes. Even if they tried to erase her later. Martha instinctively pulled Lily closer to her side, but the child slipped away, walking directly to Richard. "You tried to stand," Lily observed. "Your legs hurt now." Richard raised an eyebrow. "How you continue to surprise me, Miss Thompson." He gestured to his companion. "This is Dr. Sarah Bennett, a neurologist from Boston General." Dr. Bennett smiled warmly at Lily. "Mr. Blackwood has told me some remarkable things about you, young lady." Before Lily could respond, the door opened again, and Edward Wilson strode in, his face clouded with displeasure. "Richard, what is the meaning of this?" he demanded, barely acknowledging the others in the room. "Dr. Carter called me in a panic, saying you've scheduled new medical evaluations without authorization." "Without authorization?" Richard repeated, his voice dangerously calm. "I wasn't aware I needed permission to seek medical care, Edward." Wilson's gaze swept over Martha and Lily, lingering with obvious disdain. "And these must be the Thompsons I've heard so much about, the ones filling your head with nonsense about miraculous cures." "Watch your tone," Richard warned. "The Thompsons are my guests." Wilson pulled Richard's wheelchair away from the others. "May I speak with you privately?" Without waiting for an answer, he leaned down to whisper, "Do you have any idea what you're risking? The trust provisions are explicit. Any change in your medical status triggers a complete re-evaluation of your control over the family assets." "I'm well aware of the provisions my father put in place," Richard replied, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm also becoming aware of why he was so insistent on keeping me dependent." Wilson straightened, his face flushed. "This is highly inappropriate. These people," he gestured dismissively toward Martha and Lily, "have no business interfering in Blackwood affairs." "The Thompsons have been intertwined with the Blackwoods for generations," Richard countered, "a fact that was deliberately hidden from me." Dr. Bennett cleared her throat. "Perhaps we should focus on the medical assessment we discussed, Mr. Blackwood. I've brought the equipment for some preliminary tests." Wilson turned his cold gaze on the doctor. "Any unauthorized medical procedures could be considered a breach of the Trust's medical oversight provisions." "I'd hate to see your hospital lose its Blackwood Foundation funding, Dr. Bennett." The threat hung in the air, but before anyone could respond, Lily stepped forward. "You're scared," she said to Wilson, her young voice clear and penetrating. "Scared that if Mr. Blackwood gets better, he'll find out what you did." Wilson's face drained of color. "What ridiculous nonsense." "The papers in the blue folder," Lily continued. "The ones you changed after his father went to sleep forever. The trust wasn't supposed to work that way." A heavy silence fell over the room. Richard stared at Lily, then at Wilson, whose composed demeanor had cracked. "What blue folder?" Richard asked quietly. Wilson regained his composure with visible effort. "This child is obviously making things up. Richard, I've managed your family's affairs for 30 years. Surely you won't let these charlatans drive a wedge between us." But Richard's attention remained fixed on Lily. "What blue folder?" he repeated. Lily pointed toward the ceiling. "In the attic room, behind the painting of the boat. Your father kept all the real papers there." Martha placed a protective hand on Lily's shoulder. "Perhaps we should come back another time," she suggested, unnerved by the tension in the room. "No," Richard said firmly. "I want to know the truth." He turned to Dr. Bennett. "We'll continue with the examination as planned. Edward, you're welcome to stay and observe, or you can leave. But the decision to pursue this is mine alone." Wilson's jaw tightened. "You're making a grave mistake, Richard, one that could cost you everything." "Maybe it's time I found out what everything really means," Richard replied. After Wilson stormed out, Dr. Bennett proceeded with her examination. She tested Richard's reflexes, muscle responses, and sensory perception, her expression growing increasingly intrigued. "Mr. Blackwood, your physical responses are inconsistent with complete paralysis," she finally announced. "There's definite neural activity and muscle response. With proper therapy, I believe you could regain significant mobility." Richard absorbed this information, emotions warring on his face. So the child was right. "It appears so," Dr. Bennett confirmed. Your condition has a strong psychological component. The initial injury was real, but your ongoing paralysis is at least partially functional, what we used to call conversion disorder. In other words, my mind is keeping me in this chair, Richard said bitterly. Your mind had reasons, Lily interjected. Important ones. Richard studied the child, still struggling to reconcile her age with her insights. And you believe you know these reasons? Some of them, Lily replied. The rest you need to find yourself, starting with the blue folder. After the examination concluded, Richard insisted that Martha and Lily stay for lunch. As they ate in the grand dining room, Richard questioned Martha about their family history. Your grandmother, Eleanor, she worked for my grandfather, but that portrait suggests she was more than just a servant. Martha nodded slowly. Family stories say she was respected for her healing abilities. The Blackwoods called on her when conventional doctors failed them. And what happened in 1923? Why did she leave? Martha's expression grew troubled. The stories aren't clear. She returned to our family suddenly, refusing to speak about her time with the Blackwoods, but she carried a fear with her for the rest of her life, a fear of what she called the poison in the Blackwood veins. Richard exchanged glances with Dr. Bennett. The chemical plant was established in 1921. It's possible Eleanor discovered something about the early production methods. She wasn't just afraid of chemicals, Martha clarified. She spoke of a moral poison, greed and pride that would corrupt generations. The conversation was interrupted when Mrs. Jenkins entered the dining room, her usually composed face etched with worry. Mr. Blackwood, there's a Ms. Diana Wilson from the Department of Children and Families at the door. She says she needs to speak with Mrs. Thompson immediately. Martha's face paled. Children and families, but why? The answer came in the form of a severe-looking woman who strode into the dining room without waiting for an invitation. Diana Wilson, Edward Wilson's daughter, though this connection wasn't immediately apparent to the Thompsons, carried a leather portfolio and an air of bureaucratic authority. Martha Thompson, Diana addressed her directly. I'm here regarding a report of child endangerment concerning your granddaughter, Lily. Endangerment? Martha echoed, stunned. That's absurd. Diana opened her portfolio. We've received concerning reports that you're using your granddaughter in some sort of faith healing scheme, exposing her to potentially traumatic situations and exploiting her for financial gain. That's preposterous, Richard interjected. The Thompsons are here at my invitation. Diana gave him a cold smile. With all due respect, Mr. Blackwood, your condition makes you particularly vulnerable to exploitation. The report indicates that Mrs. Thompson and her granddaughter have been manipulating you, promising miracle cures in exchange for financial benefits. I never promised anything for money, Lily said quietly, just for food that was going to be thrown away. Diana turned her attention to the child. Lily, has your grandmother told you to say certain things to Mr. Blackwood? Things about his health or his family? Martha stood up, her dignified posture belying her inner turmoil. I will not have you questioning my granddaughter, as if we've done something wrong. We've broken no laws. Nevertheless, Diana continued smoothly, I'll need to conduct a home evaluation and interview Lily's mother. Given the nature of the allegations, we may need to consider temporary placement for Lily while we investigate. You want to take me away from Grandma? Lily asked, her voice smaller than it had been all day. For the first time, she looked like what she truly was, a 4-year-old child frightened and confused by the adult world closing in around her. Richard's face hardened with sudden resolve. That won't be necessary, Ms. Wilson. The Thompsons have done nothing wrong, and I'll personally vouch for them. Your support is noted, Mr. Blackwood, but the investigation will proceed according to department protocols. Diana's tone made it clear that even Richard's influence had its limits. Then perhaps you should also investigate why your father visited me this morning, threatening to cut off funding to Boston General if Dr. Bennett continued her examination, Richard countered, or why he was so disturbed by the mention of certain documents that might reveal tampering with my father's trust. Diana's professional mask slipped momentarily, revealing surprise. I don't know what you're implying. I think you do, Richard interrupted, and I think this sudden concern for Lily's welfare is nothing more than retaliation. Dr. Bennett stepped forward. As a medical professional who has observed the interaction between Mr. Blackwood and the Thompsons, I see no evidence of exploitation or endangerment. In fact, I'd be willing to testify that their influence has been remarkably positive. Diana hesitated, clearly not having anticipated this level of resistance. The investigation will continue regardless. Mrs. Thompson, expect a home visit within the next 48 hours. After Diana left, Martha collapsed back into her chair, her hands trembling. "They're going to take Lily," she whispered. "Edward Wilson has connections throughout the city. If he wants to punish us, he can." Richard exchanged a meaningful look with Dr. Bennett before turning to Martha. "Not if I can help it. The Wilsons may have influence, but they've forgotten who built the system they're trying to use against you." He reached for his phone. "It's time I started using the Blackwood name for something worthwhile." As Richard made calls to his attorneys and various city officials, Lily slipped away from the table and wandered to a window overlooking the grounds. Outside, she could see Edward Wilson in heated conversation with his daughter, both gesturing angrily toward the mansion. Lily wasn't surprised by this turn of events. She had seen it coming, not in any mystical way, but through simple observation of how powerful people reacted when threatened. What she hadn't anticipated was the fierce protectiveness Richard was now showing toward her family. She returned to the dining room just as Richard was finishing his calls. "Martha, I've arranged for my legal team to represent you," he informed them, "and I've made it clear to several key officials that any harassment of your family will be met with significant pushback." Martha looked overwhelmed by this sudden alliance. "Why would you do this for us?" Richard's gaze shifted to Lily. "Because your granddaughter was right about everything. And because it's time the Blackwood name stood for something more than power and secrecy." He turned his wheelchair toward the door. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I believe I have a blue folder to find in the attic." As Richard left, Dr. Bennett leaned toward Martha. "I've never seen him like this before. Whatever your granddaughter has awakened in him, it's changing him profoundly." Martha watched Lily, who was calmly finishing her dessert, as if nothing unusual had happened. "Change can be dangerous," she murmured, "especially when it threatens those who profit from keeping things the same." Outside the mansion, Edward and Diana Wilson concluded their tense conversation with grim determination. The Blackwood Empire had stood for generations, built on secrets and influence. They wouldn't allow a child, no matter how perceptive, to bring it crashing down. What they didn't realize was that the true threat wasn't Lily's knowledge of their secrets. It was her ability to make Richard Blackwood face his own truth, a truth that would soon have him rising from his wheelchair and walking a path toward redemption that would transform not just his life, but the lives of everyone connected to the Blackwood legacy. The Department of Children and Families office in downtown Boston was a maze of fluorescent-lit corridors and threadbare carpet. Emma Thompson sat rigid in an uncomfortable plastic chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as Diana Wilson reviewed her file with exaggerated thoroughness. "So, Ms. Thompson," Diana began, her tone professionally detached, "you work 2 jobs while attending nursing school, leaving your daughter primarily in the care of your mother, is that correct?" "Yes," Emma replied, struggling to keep her voice steady. "My mother has always cared for Lily while I work and study. She's the most responsible person I know." Diana made a note in her file. "And are you aware that your mother has been taking your daughter to the Blackwood estate, where they engage in some sort of healing sessions with Richard Blackwood?" Emma's jaw tightened. "My mother told me they were helping Mr. Blackwood, yes, but there's nothing inappropriate about it. Mr. Blackwood is a vulnerable individual with significant wealth," Diana countered. "And your daughter is only 4 years old, being placed in complex adult situations that could be psychologically damaging." "Lily is special," Emma said, a protective edge in her voice. "She understands things other children don't. She always has." "Special how exactly?" Diana pressed. Emma hesitated, aware that explaining Lily's unusual perceptiveness would only feed into Diana's narrative. "She's exceptionally observant and empathetic, that's all." Diana leaned forward. "Ms. Thompson, I'll be direct. We're concerned that your family is exploiting a disabled man for financial gain, using your daughter as a tool in this scheme. Given your financial struggles, it's not difficult to see the motivation." Emma stood up abruptly, her patience snapping. "We have never asked Richard Blackwood for money. Ever. The only thing Lily wanted was food that was going to be thrown away anyway. How dare you accuse us of exploitation?" Diana remained unmoved. "Please sit down, Ms. Thompson. Becoming emotional won't help your case." Before Emma could respond, the office door opened, and a distinguished older man in an expensive suit entered without knocking. "Ms. Wilson," he said, his voice carrying the smooth authority of old money and influence, "I'm Lawrence Harrington, representing the Thompson family. This interview is over. Diana rose, flustered by the interruption. Mr. Harrington, this is a formal DCF investigation. You can't simply— Actually, I can, Harrington interrupted, placing a document on her desk. This is a temporary restraining order, preventing DCF from pursuing this obviously retaliatory investigation until a judicial review can be conducted. You'll note it's signed by Judge Michaels. Diana blanched at the name. Judge Eleanor Michaels was known for her strict ethical standards and intolerance for bureaucratic overreach. Furthermore, Harrington continued, I've filed a formal complaint regarding the clear conflict of interest in this case. Your father's business relationship with the Blackwood estate and his documented threats against the Thompsons prior to your sudden interest in their family welfare raise serious ethical concerns. Emma watched this exchange with a mixture of relief and confusion. Mr. Harrington, I don't understand. Who hired you? The lawyer turned to her with a reassuring smile. Richard Blackwood retained our firm this morning to represent your family's interests. He was quite insistent. Across town, Richard Blackwood was making good on his promise to investigate the mysterious blue folder Lily had mentioned. The attic of the Blackwood mansion was a vast space filled with generations of family history, furniture, trunks, paintings, and documents carefully preserved against the ravages of time. Richard had enlisted the help of Mrs. Jenkins, who now pushed his wheelchair through the narrow pathways between stacked heirlooms. I've never been comfortable up here, Mrs. Jenkins admitted, glancing nervously at the shadowy corners. Your father forbade the staff from entering except for annual cleaning, and even then, only under supervision. My father had many secrets, Richard replied grimly. I'm beginning to understand just how many. They stopped before a large painting depicting a schooner sailing through tumultuous seas. This must be the one Lily mentioned, Richard said, studying the artwork. Help me move it. Behind the painting, they discovered a wall safe with a combination lock. Did my father ever mention this safe to you? Richard asked. Mrs. Jenkins shook her head. Never, but there might be a clue in his personal almanac. He wrote everything in code there. After retrieving the almanac from Harold Blackwood's study, Richard spent hours deciphering his father's system. As the afternoon faded into evening, he finally cracked the combination. The date Blackwood Chemical had settled the class action lawsuit, followed by the amount paid to silence the plaintiffs. The safe contained several folders, but the blue one stood out immediately. Inside were the original trust documents for the Blackwood family fortune, documents substantially different from the ones Richard had been shown after his father's passing. My God, Richard whispered as he read through the papers. The trust was never conditional on my disability. That provision was added later. He looked up at Mrs. Jenkins, his face pale with anger. Edward Wilson altered my father's trust after his death, ensuring I would remain dependent on him for access to my own inheritance. Mrs. Jenkins clasped a hand to her mouth. That's criminal. It certainly is, Richard agreed, carefully placing the documents back in the folder. And it explains why Wilson was so threatened by Lily. Somehow that extraordinary child knew exactly where to find the proof of his betrayal. But the blue folder contained more than just the trust documents. Beneath them, Richard found a leather-bound journal bearing his grandfather's initials. The journal detailed Jonathan Blackwood's earliest business dealings, including the founding of Blackwood Chemical. One entry in particular caught Richard's attention. October 15, 1922, E.T. confronted me today about the river tests. Claims the water shows evidence of contamination that will affect generations. Nonsense, of course, but her conviction is unsettling. She threatens to make her findings public if we don't change our waste disposal methods. Such interference cannot be tolerated, regardless of her value to the household. Richard continued reading, his horror growing with each entry. December 3rd, 1922. E.T. has been gathering soil and water samples. Claims her sister's illness is connected to our factory. Had Wilson Sr. confiscate her materials and restrict her movement outside the estate. March 18, 1923. E.T. becoming increasingly problematic. Her healing abilities make her difficult to dismiss outright without raising questions. Wilson Sr. suggests a more permanent solution to protect company interests. April 30, 1923. Issue with E.T. finally resolved. Substantial payment arranged in exchange for silence and immediate departure. Wilson Sr. has ensured all her evidence has been destroyed. Additional pressure applied through threats to her family's security. She will not trouble us again. Richard closed the journal, his hands trembling. Eleanor Thompson had discovered the environmental damage caused by Blackwood Chemical in its earliest days. Rather than address her concerns, his grandfather had silenced her through threats and coercion. The parallels to the present situation were chilling. Once again, a Thompson woman and her extraordinary child were threatening to expose Blackwood's secrets. Once again, a Wilson was orchestrating their silencing. Richard's phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. It was Dr. Bennett. "Richard, we have a problem," she said without preamble. "Someone's trying to revoke my medical license on grounds of ethical violations, specifically conducting unauthorized examinations and participating in exploitative alternative healing practices." "Wilson," Richard growled. "He's retaliating against everyone who supported the Thompsons." "It gets worse," Dr. Bennett continued. "I've heard from colleagues at Boston Children's Hospital that someone's been inquiring about having Lily evaluated for delusional disorders. They're building a case that Martha and Emma Thompson are encouraging pathological behavior in a vulnerable child." Richard's grip on his phone tightened. "They're trying to discredit Lily by claiming she's mentally unstable." "Exactly. And with Edward Wilson's connections, he might succeed in having her temporarily removed from her family for evaluation." "Not if I can help it," Richard declared. "Meet me at the Thompson apartment in an hour. Bring your medical equipment and any documentation from our session yesterday. I have a plan." At the Thompson apartment, Martha was helping Lily pack a small backpack with essential items. "Are we running away, Grandma?" Lily asked, her voice calm despite the circumstances. Martha stroked her granddaughter's hair. "Just being prepared, little one. Sometimes the best defense is to not be where trouble expects to find you." Emma burst through the door, Lawrence Harrington following behind her. "Mum, Lily, thank God you're both still here." Martha embraced her daughter. "What happened at DCF?" "They were building a case to take Lily," Emma explained, her voice shaking. "But Mr. Harrington stopped them, at least temporarily." She turned to the lawyer. "I still don't understand why Richard Blackwood would help us like this." "Mr. Blackwood has his reasons," Harrington replied diplomatically, "and he's asked me to inform you that he's on his way here now. He believes the safest place for all of you tonight is at his estate, where his security team can ensure no unexpected visits from DCF or law enforcement." Martha looked skeptical. "The Blackwood mansion? After everything our family has suffered because of them." "It's different now," Lily said softly. "Mr. Blackwood found the blue folder. He knows the truth." Before anyone could question how Lily knew this, there was a knock at the door. Emma opened it to find Richard Blackwood in his wheelchair, accompanied by Dr. Bennett. "I apologize for the intrusion," Richard said, wheeling himself into the modest apartment. "But we don't have much time. Edward Wilson is mobilizing every resource at his disposal to separate Lily from your family and discredit anyone who supports you." "Why?" Emma asked, bewildered by the intensity of the attack. "What could he possibly gain by going after a 4-year-old girl?" Richard extracted the blue folder from his jacket. "Because your daughter has inadvertently exposed decades of fraud, manipulation and corruption. Wilson altered my father's trust after his death, adding provisions that kept me dependent on his management. If I regain the ability to walk, which your daughter correctly identified as possible, his control over the Blackwood fortune would end." Martha's eyes widened. "Just like Eleanor." "Yes," Richard confirmed. "I found my grandfather's journal as well. Eleanor Thompson discovered that Blackwood Chemical was poisoning the river back in 1922. She was silenced, just as Wilson is trying to silence Lily now." Dr. Bennett stepped forward. "We need to act quickly. Wilson is attempting to have me discredited and is building a case that Lily suffers from delusional disorders, a claim that could be used to separate her from you for her own good." Emma instinctively pulled Lily closer. "What can we do?" "First," Richard said, "we document everything." He nodded to Dr. Bennett, who began setting up her equipment. "We'll conduct a full, properly witnessed medical examination of me, establishing that Lily's assessment of my condition was medically accurate. Second," he continued, "we secure the original trust documents and my grandfather's journal as evidence of Wilson's fraud and the historical pattern of Blackwood-Wilson corruption. And third," he finished, "we go public. The Blackwood name still carries weight in this city. It's time I used that influence for something other than maintaining the status quo." Martha studied Richard with newfound respect. "You're really willing to expose your own family's secrets, to admit that the Blackwood fortune was built on suffering and deception?" Richard met her gaze steadily. Yes, because your granddaughter helped me see that my paralysis wasn't just physical, it was moral. I've been complicit through my silence and inaction. That ends today. As Dr. Bennett conducted her examination, documenting Richard's improving neural responses and muscle function, Lily sat quietly observing. When the doctor finished, the child approached Richard's wheelchair. "It's time to try again," she said simply. "Try what?" Richard asked, though he already knew the answer. "Standing," Lily replied. "But this time you need to want it, not just for yourself, but for all the people the river remembers." The room fell silent as the adults watched this extraordinary exchange between the powerful businessman and the perceptive child. Richard closed his eyes, absorbing Lily's words. When he opened them again, there was a new resolve in his expression. "Help me," he said, extending his hands to Dr. Bennett and Martha. With their support on either side, Richard began the painful process of rising from his wheelchair. His legs trembled violently, muscles atrophied from years of disuse straining against gravity. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he fought not only his physical limitations, but the psychological barriers that had kept him confined. "Remember why you fell," Lily encouraged softly, "and why you need to rise." With a final surge of effort, Richard Blackwood stood upright for the first time in nearly a decade. His legs shook beneath him, but they held. Dr. Bennett quickly documented this milestone, while Emma recorded it on her phone. Irrefutable evidence that the miracle Lily had promised was rooted in medical reality, not childish fantasy. As Richard took his first tentative step, supported by those around him, the apartment's front door suddenly burst open. Edward Wilson stood in the doorway, flanked by Diana and 2 police officers. "What is going on here?" Wilson demanded, his face contorting with shock as he saw Richard standing. "Justice," Richard replied, his voice steady despite the physical strain. "Something long overdue for both our families." Wilson's eyes darted to the blue folder on the table, then back to Richard. Understanding and fear flashed across his features as he realized what had been discovered. "Officers," Wilson said quickly, regaining his composure, "I'd like to report a case of elder abuse and exploitation. These people have been manipulating Mr. Blackwood, a vulnerable, disabled man." "Former wheelchair user," Richard corrected, taking another small step forward with Dr. Bennett's assistance. "As you can see, I'm standing on my own 2 feet now, Edward. Just like I'll be standing in court when I testify about how you altered my father's trust documents after his death." The officers looked uncertainly between Wilson and Richard, clearly confused by the situation. "Mr. Wilson," one finally said, "you told us this was an emergency child welfare situation." "It is," Wilson insisted. "The child is being used in some sort of scam." "The only scam here," Richard interrupted, "is the one you've been running for the past decade." He turned to the officers. "Gentlemen, I suggest you contact your superiors before proceeding. This situation is considerably more complex than Mr. Wilson has led you to believe." As if on cue, Lawrence Harrington stepped forward, presenting his credentials. "Officers, I represent both Mr. Blackwood and the Thompson family. I've already filed preliminary documentation with the District Attorney's Office regarding Mr. Wilson's fraudulent activities. I believe you'll find your department has been given instructions to proceed with caution in this matter." Wilson's face drained of color as he realized his carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. In desperation, he lunged for the blue folder, but Richard was faster despite his unsteady legs. With one fluid motion that surprised even himself, Richard stepped forward and blocked Wilson's path. "It's over, Edward," he said quietly. "The truth is finally rising to the surface, just like Eleanor Thompson warned would happen all those years ago." As the officers, now receiving updated instructions through their radios, began to question Wilson instead of the Thompsons, Lily tugged on Richard's sleeve. "The river remembers," she whispered. "And now so do you." Richard looked down at the extraordinary child who had changed everything, and for the first time in years he felt something long forgotten. Hope, not just for himself, but for the possibility of redemption, for making amends for generations of Blackwood sins through actions rather than guilt. Standing on his own 2 feet at last, Richard Blackwood prepared to take the most important steps of his life, steps toward justice, toward healing, and toward a future where the Blackwood name would stand for something worthy of respect rather than fear. The next morning, Boston awoke to headlines that sent shockwaves through the city's elite circles. "Blackwood hair walks again, alleges fraud," and Blackwood chemical legacy questioned as family secrets emerge. Richard had wasted no time in taking his story public, granting exclusive interviews to journalists known for their integrity rather than their connections to powerful interests. At the Blackwood mansion, now a hive of activity, Richard moved carefully with a walker, each step a painful reminder of years spent unnecessarily confined to a wheelchair. Dr. Bennett supervised his physical therapy while a team of independent auditors pored over financial records, seeking the full extent of Edward Wilson's manipulations. "The progress you're making is remarkable, Doctor," Bennett observed as Richard completed another circuit around the conservatory. "Your muscles are responding far better than I would have expected after so many years of disuse." "I have a good motivation," Richard replied, nodding toward Lily, who sat cross-legged beside the fountain, seemingly conversing with the water. The child had insisted on coming to the mansion every day to help with the healing, as she put it. Martha and Emma Thompson had been installed in guest rooms, partly for their protection from media intrusion, and partly because Lily refused to be separated from Richard during this critical transition. Emma had taken leave from her jobs, supported by a consulting fee. Richard insisted on paying for the Thompson family's assistance with his rehabilitation. "Mr. Blackwood," Lawrence Harrington called, entering the conservatory with a tablet in hand. "The district attorney would like to meet this afternoon. They're considering charges against Edward Wilson for trust fraud and document falsification." Richard nodded. "Schedule it for 3. And what about the environmental review?" "The independent scientists are already collecting samples from the Merrimack River sites. Preliminary findings confirm contamination levels consistent with the historical dumping your grandfather's journal described." Richard's jaw tightened. "Make sure they have everything they need. No expense spared. We need the complete truth, no matter how damaging to the Blackwood name." As Harrington departed, Richard lowered himself carefully onto a bench near Lily. "What are you telling the water?" he asked, genuinely curious about the child's unusual behavior. "I'm not telling it anything," Lily replied without looking up. "I'm listening to what it remembers." Richard had grown accustomed to Lily's enigmatic statements, no longer dismissing them as childish imagination. "And what does it remember?" "Pain," Lily said simply, "but also hope. The river knows you're trying to make things right." Before Richard could respond, Mrs. Jenkins appeared, her expression troubled. "Mr. Blackwood, Dr. Carter is at the door. He's quite insistent on seeing you." Richard exchanged glances with Dr. Bennett. "Show him in. It's time we heard what he has to say." "Doctor." James Carter entered the conservatory, his normally impeccable appearance somewhat disheveled. He stopped short at the sight of Richard standing with his walker. "My God," he whispered. "It's true, then?" "Yes, James," Richard confirmed coldly. "It seems I'm making a miraculous recovery from a condition that apparently could have been treated years ago." Carter's shoulders slumped. "Richard, I need to explain—" "Explain what?" Richard interrupted. "How you conspired with my father and Wilson to keep me dependent. How you falsified medical reports to maintain the fiction that I couldn't possibly walk again." "It wasn't like that," Carter protested. "At least not entirely." He glanced nervously at the others present. "Could we speak privately?" "Anything you have to say can be said in front of Dr. Bennett and the Thompsons," Richard insisted. "They're the ones who actually helped me, after all." Carter sighed, lowering himself into a chair. "The initial diagnosis was genuine, Richard. Your spinal injury was severe, and at the time, we truly believed permanent paralysis was likely. But that changed." "Dr. Bennett interjected. "The follow-up scans showed healing, didn't they?" Carter nodded reluctantly. "After about 2 years, yes. There were signs of neural regeneration that suggested partial recovery might be possible with intensive therapy." "And you didn't tell me," Richard said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Your father intercepted the reports," Carter admitted. "He convinced me that the psychological trauma of your accident, combined with what you'd discovered about Blackwood Chemical, had left you too fragile for the difficult rehabilitation process." Richard laughed bitterly. "Too fragile? Or too likely to take control of the company and change its direction if I regained my independence?" Carter couldn't meet his eyes. "Harold was concerned about your idealistic tendencies. He believed you would dismantle everything he and your grandfather had built." "You mean he was afraid I'd take responsibility for the damage Blackwood Chemical had done?" Richard corrected. "That I'd compensate the victims, clean up the contamination, change our business practices. The liability would have been enormous," Carter said weakly. The company might not have survived. So instead, you helped him ensure that I wouldn't survive, not as a whole person. Richard's grip on his walker tightened until his knuckles turned white. Do you have any idea what you took from me, James? 10 years of my life. 10 years I could have been walking, working, building something worthwhile instead of this toxic legacy. Martha, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. Dr. Carter, did you know about Eleanor Thompson's warnings? About the river contamination back in the 1920s? Carter looked surprised by the question. No, that was before my time with the family. Why? Because history repeats itself, Martha said gravely. When a Thompson woman warned the Blackwoods about poison in the past, she was silenced. When my granddaughter tried to help Richard see the truth, your colleagues attempted to label her as delusional and take her away from us. Lily, who had been seemingly absorbed in the fountain, suddenly turned to face Carter. You're not a bad doctor, she said, startling everyone with her interjection. You just forgot that healing isn't just about bodies. Carter stared at the child, visibly unnerved by her insight. Who is this girl, really? She's exactly what she appears to be, Richard answered. A remarkably perceptive child who saw through decades of Blackwood lies with a clarity the rest of us lacked. Dr. Bennett moved to stand beside Richard. Dr. Carter, as a medical professional, you have a choice to make. You can continue defending the indefensible, or you can help us document exactly how this conspiracy to keep Richard disabled was maintained. Carter seemed to age before their eyes, the weight of his complicity finally breaking through his professional facade. What would you have me do? Tell the truth, Richard said simply. Provide a complete statement about my father's instructions, Wilson's involvement, and your own role in falsifying my medical records. I'll lose my license, Carter protested weakly. Probably, Richard acknowledged without sympathy. But it's better than losing your freedom. The district attorney is already building a case against Wilson. Don't make them add you to it. While this confrontation unfolded, Lily had returned to the fountain, trailing her fingers through the water. The truth wants to come out, she murmured, like the water wants to be clean again. Something in her words caught Richard's attention. He turned to Martha. Your grandmother, Eleanor, you said she was collecting water samples back in the 1920s. Do you know what happened to her research? Martha shook her head. Family stories say everything was taken from her when she was forced to leave the Blackwood service. Not everything, Lily corrected, looking up from the fountain. She hid her real notebook in the place where water meets stone. The adults exchanged puzzled glances. What does that mean, Lily? Emma asked gently. The old well, Richard realized suddenly. There was a decorative well in the East Garden back then. It appears in photographs from that era. My father had it sealed up in the 1970s, claimed it was a safety hazard. Or he was hiding something, Dr. Bennett suggested. Richard turned to Mrs. Jenkins. Have the gardeners locate the old well immediately. Tell them to bring equipment to open it. As Carter was escorted to the study to provide his statement to Harrington, and the gardeners began their search for the sealed well, Richard continued his physical therapy with renewed determination. Each step was agony, but with Dr. Bennett's guidance and Lily's enigmatic encouragement, he pushed through the pain. You're not just healing your legs, Lily told him during a rest break. You're healing your family's poison, that's why it hurts so much. Richard studied the child thoughtfully. You know, Lily, most people would find it difficult to believe that a 4-year-old could understand these complex situations, let alone help resolve them. Lily shrugged. People see what they expect to see. They didn't expect to see you walking either. Touché, Richard smiled before growing serious again. I owe you and your family more than I can ever repay. You don't owe us, Lily corrected him. You owe the river, and all the people it touches. Before Richard could respond, a commotion at the conservatory entrance drew their attention. Edward Wilson stood there, flanked by 2 men who, despite their expensive suits, had the unmistakable bearing of private security. This is a private residence, Mr. Wilson, Mrs. Jenkins declared, attempting to block his path. You are not welcome here. Wilson brushed past her. I have business with Mr. Blackwood that can't wait. Richard straightened, gripping his walker firmly. Whatever you have to say can be said through our attorneys, Edward. This goes beyond legal matters, Wilson replied, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. You're destroying generations of work, Richard. The Blackwood name, the company, the foundation, all of it at risk, because of what? Some misplaced guilt over business decisions made decades before you were born. Not guilt, Richard corrected. responsibility, something the Blackwood family has avoided for too long. Wilson's gaze shifted to Lily, who had moved to stand protectively near Richard. And all because of this child and her family of charlatans. Be careful, Edward, Richard warned. The Thompsons have done nothing but help me see the truth, a truth your family has been helping mine bury for nearly a century. My grandfather protected your grandfather's interests, Wilson snapped. My father protected your father's legacy. I've spent my career protecting you even from yourself. And this is how you repay that loyalty. By dredging up ancient history that benefits no one. It benefits those who were harmed, Richard replied steadily. The families who suffered health problems from the contamination, the communities whose water was poisoned. They deserve justice, even if it comes decades late. Wilson laughed bitterly. Justice? You sound like a naive college student, not the heir to one of Boston's great fortunes. There are no victims here, Richard. Only people looking for handouts from a wealthy family. Martha stepped forward, her dignity undiminished by Wilson's disdain. My Aunt Rose died at 37 from a rare cancer. 23 other people in our neighborhood developed the same cancer within 5 years, all of them drawing water from wells near the Blackwood plant. Coincidence? Wilson dismissed. Or poor genetics. The scientific studies were inconclusive. The studies your family suppressed were quite conclusive, Richard countered. As were the water samples Eleanor Thompson collected, samples we're about to recover. Wilson's face paled slightly. What are you talking about? Before Richard could explain, a gardener appeared at the doorway. Mr. Blackwood, we've found the well, sir, and something else too. A metal box embedded in the stonework. Wilson moved with surprising speed for a man his age, gesturing to his security men. Stop him! But Richard was quicker, pressing an emergency button on his walker that immediately summoned his own security team. Within moments, Wilson and his men were surrounded by Blackwood security personnel. Your father warned me this might happen, Wilson said bitterly. That someday you might discover the truth and let it cloud your judgment. That's why he structured the trust as he did, to protect the family legacy from your conscience. My father was wrong, Richard replied simply. And so are you. As Wilson and his men were escorted from the property, Richard turned to the gardener. Bring the box to the conservatory immediately. The metal container, though corroded by nearly a century of humidity, had protected its contents remarkably well. Inside was a leather-bound notebook filled with Eleanor Thompson's meticulous documentation, water sample results, interviews with affected families, maps showing the spread of contamination, and most damning of all, a copy of an internal Blackwood chemical memo acknowledging the toxicity of their waste products as early as 1921. This is it, Richard breathed, carefully turning the fragile pages. The evidence Eleanor tried to present, the truth my family buried. Martha touched the notebook reverently. My grandmother kept this secret all these years, waiting for the right time, the right person to find it. And the right child to guide them to it, Emma added. Watching Lily, who seemed unsurprised by the discovery, Richard looked up from the notebook, his expression resolute. This changes everything. With this evidence combined with my grandfather's journal and the new water testing, we can finally establish the historical pattern of contamination and cover-up. Dr. Bennett, who had been examining the medical notes in Eleanor's journal, looked troubled. These symptoms she documented in the affected families, they're consistent with exposure to the chemicals we now know were in Blackwood's waste stream. The cancer clusters, the neurological issues, the reproductive problems. This was a public health disaster. One that we're going to acknowledge and address, Richard declared, no matter the cost to the Blackwood fortune. As the implications of the discovery settled over them, Lily approached Richard, tugging gently on his sleeve. You're ready now, she said cryptically. Ready for what? Richard asked. To walk without the walker, Lily replied with complete confidence. Your body is stronger than you think, and so is your heart. Richard looked skeptical, but Dr. Bennett nodded encouragingly. She might be right. Your progress has been extraordinary. With support on either side, you could try. With Martha on his left and Dr. Bennett on his right, Richard cautiously released his grip on the walker. His legs trembled with the effort, but they held his weight. Slowly, painfully, he took one step forward, then another. Think about why you're walking, Lily instructed from a few feet ahead. Not just for yourself. Richard focused on her words, finding strength in the purpose that now drove him. Each step became a commitment to truth, to justice, to healing the wounds his family had inflicted. By the time he reached Lily, he was moving with growing confidence, his body remembering what his mind had forced it to forget. As Richard stood before the child who had catalyzed his transformation, the full circle of their unlikely connection became clear. The Thompson women had tried to hold the Blackwoods accountable a century ago. Now a Thompson child had succeeded where her ancestor had failed, not through confrontation, but through healing. "You did it," Lily said simply, looking up at the man now standing straight without support for the first time in a decade. "No," Richard corrected gently. "We did it. Together." Outside the conservatory windows, the gardeners were removing the last of the concrete seal from the old well, allowing fresh air to reach its depths for the first time in decades. Like the secrets long buried in the Blackwood past, the well was finally exposed to the light of day, the first step in a cleansing process that would take years, but had now irrevocably begun. 1 year later, the eastern wing of the former Blackwood mansion buzzed with activity as children laughed and played in what had once been formal gardens. The imposing stone walls were now adorned with colorful murals, the wrought iron gates permanently opened to welcome the community inside. Richard Blackwood, dressed in casual clothes that would have horrified his father, walked confidently across the lawn toward a small gathering near the restored well. His gait still held a slight hesitation, a reminder of the years spent in a wheelchair, but Dr. Bennett had declared his recovery nothing short of remarkable. "Mr. Richard," a chorus of young voices greeted him as he approached the children's science class being conducted outdoors. "Are you going to tell us the story again?" Richard smiled. "I think Ms. Lily might be better at that than me." 5-year-old Lily Thompson, now a kindergartner at the newly established Blackwood Thompson Learning Center, stepped forward with the poise of someone much older. The center, funded by the Blackwood Foundation but guided by Martha Thompson's educational philosophy, provided advanced learning opportunities for children from South Boston and surrounding communities. "It's not just a story," Lily corrected gently. "It's history." The children settled on the grass as Lily began recounting the tale they'd all heard before, but never tired of, how Eleanor Thompson had discovered that the Blackwood factory was poisoning the river, how she had hidden her evidence in the well, and how nearly a century later, the truth had finally come to light. "And that's why we test the water every month," Lily concluded, gesturing to the science equipment set up near the well, "to make sure it stays clean and safe for everyone." As the science teacher took over, explaining the water testing process to the eager students, Richard made his way to where Martha and Emma Thompson sat beneath an oak tree, watching with evident pride. "She's a natural teacher," Richard observed, lowering himself carefully onto a bench beside them. "Always has been," Martha agreed, "though her methods are uniquely her own." Indeed, Lily's approach to education defied conventional categories. Her extraordinary perceptiveness had been channeled into a peer mentoring program that paired her with both gifted students and those with learning differences, with remarkable results for both groups. "The school board called again," Emma informed Richard. "They want to study Lily's methods for possible implementation statewide." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "Only if she wants to participate." No pressure. This had become his standard response to the many requests for Lily's involvement in various projects. Despite his belief in her abilities, Richard remained fiercely protective of her right to a normal childhood, something his own privilege had never fully afforded him. The transformation of Richard Blackwood over the past year had been as remarkable as his physical recovery. The ruthless businessman had evolved into a dedicated environmental advocate and education reformer. The Blackwood fortune, once built on exploitation and secrecy, was now being systematically redirected toward healing the very communities his family had harmed. "Have you seen the latest water test results from the Merrimack?" Martha asked. Richard nodded, his expression brightening. "Contamination levels down 60% since we implemented the remediation program. It's working faster than anyone predicted." The cleanup of the river had become Richard's personal mission. After Edward Wilson's financial manipulations had been exposed, resulting in his disbarment and multiple civil judgments against him, Richard had gained full control of the Blackwood assets. His first action had been to establish a $500 million environmental restoration fund specifically targeted at areas affected by Blackwood Chemicals' historical dumping. "And the health clinic?" Emma inquired. As part of her nursing program, she had been involved in establishing a free clinic that specialized in treating conditions linked to environmental contamination. Fully funded for the next 20 years, Richard assured her. Dr. Bennett has assembled an excellent team. The conversation paused as Lawrence Harrington approached, carrying a leather portfolio. Now serving as the Blackwood Foundation's legal counsel, Harrington had become an essential ally in navigating the complex process of making amends for generations of corporate malfeasance. The settlement with the last group of affected families has been finalized, Harrington reported. All 67 cases resolved without litigation, as you requested. Richard exhaled with relief. Thank you, Lawrence. And the Historical Documentation Project. The university archivists are digitizing Eleanor Thompson's notebooks and all the related Blackwood documents. They'll be available to researchers and the public by the end of the year. This transparency, making public the full history of Blackwood Chemicals' environmental impact and subsequent cover-up, had been one of Richard's non-negotiable conditions. Despite warnings about reputational damage and potential additional liability, he had insisted that healing could only come through complete honesty. As Harrington departed, Richard noticed Lily separating herself from the science class and walking purposefully toward the mansion's conservatory. Curiosity piqued, he excused himself from Martha and Emma and followed her. The conservatory, once a display of exotic plants collected by generations of Blackwoods, had been transformed into a living classroom. Indigenous plants from the Merrimack River watershed now filled the space, part of a seed banking project to preserve native species affected by decades of pollution. Richard found Lily standing by the central fountain, her small hand trailing through the water, just as she had done a year earlier when she first told him he could walk again. "Everything okay, Lily?" he asked gently. She nodded without looking up. "The water is happy now. It says thank you." Richard had grown accustomed to Lily's unique way of expressing herself. Whether her connection to the natural world was an extraordinary form of intuition, as Martha believed, or simply a child's imaginative expression of empathy, he had learned not to dismiss it. "I'm the one who should be saying thank you," Richard replied, carefully lowering himself to sit at her level. "You changed everything, Lily. Not just for me, but for so many people." Lily finally turned to face him. "It wasn't just me. It was Eleanor, too. And the river. And you, because you chose to listen." "Not right away," Richard admitted with a rueful smile. "I was pretty stubborn at first. Most grown-ups are," Lily observed with the matter-of-fact wisdom that still occasionally startled him. "They forget how to see what's really there." A comfortable silence fell between them as they watched the play of light through the water. In the year since their first encounter, their unlikely friendship had deepened into something that defied conventional relationships. Richard had become a kind of honorary uncle to Lily, while she remained his most honest advisor, unencumbered by adult pretenses or professional agendas. "Dr. Carter came to the clinic yesterday," Lily said suddenly. Richard raised an eyebrow in surprise. James Carter, after providing a full statement about his role in concealing Richard's potential recovery, had surrendered his medical license and withdrawn from public life. "What did he want?" Richard asked, trying to keep his tone neutral. "To help," Lily replied simply. "He knows things about the chemicals that made people sick. He wants to teach the new doctors." Richard considered this information thoughtfully. Carter's expertise in treating conditions related to chemical exposure could indeed be valuable, even without a medical license. And the man's evident remorse over the past year suggested a genuine desire for redemption. "Do you think I should meet with him?" Richard asked. Lily nodded. "Healing works in circles. He needs to heal too." "Circles," Richard repeated thoughtfully. "Like how Eleanor tried to expose the truth, and then you finished what she started 100 years later. And now you're making the river clean again," Lily added. "That's how circles work." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Diana Wilson, looking vastly different from the intimidating DCF official who had once threatened to separate Lily from her family. After her father's disgrace, Diana had resigned from the department and, following a period of reflection, approached Richard with a proposal to reform the child welfare system from within. Now serving as community liaison for the Blackwood Thompson Learning Center, Diana had become an unexpected ally in creating programs that supported vulnerable families rather than separating them. "Sorry to interrupt," Diana said, "but the mayor's office just called. They want to move up the ceremony for the river restoration project to next week." Richard sighed. The eternal rush of politics. Tell them we'll accommodate if possible, but the science team sets the schedule, not the mayor's re-election campaign. Diana nodded, a smile tugging at her lips. The new Richard Blackwood, who prioritized substance over appearances and science over politics, was still adjusting to his role as a public figure, one now admired for his integrity rather than feared for his power. Also, Diana continued, the documentary team is here to film the afternoon science program. Should I tell them you're available for an interview? The documentary, chronicling the Blackwood chemical environmental impact, the Thompson family's century-long quest for justice, and the remarkable partnership between Richard and Lily, had been approved only after extensive discussion with Emma and Martha about how to protect Lily from excessive public attention. I'll do it if Lily is comfortable with them being here, Richard decided, looking to the child for confirmation. It's okay, Lily assured him. People need to know about the river, and about Eleanor. As Diana departed to make the arrangements, Richard and Lily made their way back outside where the afternoon light bathed the grounds in a golden glow. The mansion that had once symbolized isolation and privilege now pulsed with community activity, art classes in the former ballroom, science labs in the renovated stables, community meetings in the grand dining hall. Near the entrance, a new bronze plaque gleamed in the sunlight, the Blackwood Thompson Center for Community Learning and Environmental Healing. The river remembers, we remember, we heal together. Established 2025. Richard paused to read the inscription, as he often did when passing by. The words, Lily's words, had become something of a mantra for the entire project, encapsulating both acknowledgement of past harm and commitment to future healing. "Mr. Blackwood," called a voice from across the lawn. It was Mrs. Jenkins, who had transitioned from household manager to administrative director of the center, with remarkable enthusiasm. "The board members are arriving for the quarterly meeting." Richard checked his watch. "Already? Time flies when you're playing with water," Lily suggested with a grin. "Exactly," Richard laughed. "Will you be joining us for the beginning of the meeting?" "The student representatives are presenting their river monitoring project." Lily nodded eagerly. The center's governance model, which included representation from community members, environmental experts, and even student delegates, was yet another departure from the traditional Blackwood approach to power. As they walked toward the main building, Richard reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past year. The physical therapy had been grueling, the legal battles exhausting, the public scrutiny intense. Yet through it all, the simple wisdom of a child had been his constant guide, reminding him that true healing required honesty, that responsibility was not the same as guilt, and that the past could be acknowledged without being imprisoned by it. The quarterly board meeting, held in what had once been Richard's father's imposing study, reflected the transformation of the Blackwood legacy. Around the table sat a diverse group of community leaders, scientists, educators, and health professionals, many from families that had been affected by Blackwood Chemical's environmental impact generations earlier. Richard opened the meeting with a brief update on the river restoration project, then turned the floor over to the student representatives. Two 10-year-olds from the center's environmental science program presented their findings with surprising sophistication, showing charts of improving water quality and returning wildlife. "The osprey are nesting again at the North Bend," announced one excited student, pointing to photographs of the majestic birds. They hadn't been seen there since the 1950s. As the presentation continued, Richard found himself watching Lily, who sat attentively beside Martha. A year ago, he would have dismissed the idea that a 4-year-old child could catalyze such profound change. Now he knew better than to underestimate the power of perception, unfiltered by adult preconceptions and prejudices. When the meeting concluded, Richard approached Martha while Lily was engaged in conversation with the student presenters. "I've been meaning to ask you something," he said quietly. "Eleanor's journal mentioned a tradition in your family, something about knowledge being passed down from grandmother to granddaughter. Is that why Lily is so extraordinary?" Martha considered the question thoughtfully. "The Thompson women have always had a special way of seeing the world," she acknowledged. "Some call it intuition, others healing wisdom. My mother taught me as her mother taught her." "But Lily seems different," Richard pressed. "Her insights go beyond what could be taught or explained." "Yes," Martha agreed. "In our family, the gift usually manifests fully in adulthood. Lily is the first to show such ability so young. She watched her granddaughter with a mixture of pride and concern. It's both a blessing and a responsibility. Richard nodded, understanding the weight of exceptional gifts. Whatever it is, I'm grateful for it. Without Lily, I'd still be in that wheelchair, trapped by my father's manipulations and my own fear. And without you listening to her, Martha countered, her insights would have remained just the imaginings of a child that no one took seriously. She smiled warmly. That's the real miracle, Richard. Not that Lily could see the truth, but that you were willing to hear it. As the afternoon sun began to cast long shadows across the grounds, the day's activities wound down. Families collected their children, staff members completed their closing tasks, and a peaceful quiet settled over the center. Richard found himself drawn once more to the old well, now beautifully restored with a plaque honoring Eleanor Thompson's courage and foresight. Beside it stood a simple bench, where he often came to reflect on the journey that had brought him here. As he sat down, he was unsurprised when Lily appeared a few moments later, as if sensing his contemplative mood. "Full circle," she said, settling beside him on the bench. "What do you mean?" Richard asked. "Eleanor tried to make the Blackwoods listen about the river," Lily explained. "Now a Blackwood is making everyone listen." Richard smiled at her perspective. "I suppose you're right, though I doubt my grandfather or father would recognize what the Blackwood name stands for now." "They wouldn't," Lily agreed matter-of-factly. "But that's okay. The river doesn't care about names. It just wants to be clean." In the simplicity of her statement, Richard found the essence of what the past year had taught him, that healing wasn't about reputations or legacies or even atonement. It was about doing what needed to be done, regardless of how it reflected on the past. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "people keep calling what happened a miracle. Me walking again, the changes to the foundation, this center. But it wasn't really a miracle, was it?" "No," Lily agreed. "It was just truth. Was truth that was always there, waiting for someone to see it." As the setting sun gilded the restored well, the revitalized gardens and the transformed mansion, Richard Blackwood reflected on how his life had changed since the day a 4-year-old girl had knocked on his door with an impossible promise. He had gained not just the ability to walk again, but something far more valuable: the courage to face the truth about his family's past and the vision to create a different future. And Lily Thompson, now recognized not as an anomaly to be studied, but as a gifted child to be nurtured, had found a platform where her unique perception could benefit an entire community. The food she had originally sought for her family was now provided to hundreds through the center's meal programs, while the knowledge she had intuited about Richard's condition was being applied to help others struggling with psychosomatic symptoms. "Time to go home," Martha called from the path. "Your mother will be waiting dinner for us." As Lily rose to leave, Richard asked one final question that had been on his mind. "Lily, how did you know? That first day, how did you know I could walk again?" Lily considered the question seriously. "I saw how your body wanted to move when you didn't think anyone was watching, and I saw how your heart wanted to be free from what your family did. They were the same thing." With that profound observation, she skipped off to join her grandmother, leaving Richard to marvel once again at the wisdom that could come from such an unexpected source. The Blackwood Thompson Center would continue to evolve in the years ahead, as would the relationship between the two families, once separated by wealth and power, but now united in purpose. The river would gradually heal, as would the communities affected by generations of environmental neglect, and Richard Blackwood, once imprisoned by his family's secrets and his own complicity, would walk freely into a future defined not by the Blackwood legacy of power and privilege, but by the Thompson tradition of healing and truth. As twilight settled over the grounds, Richard took one last look at the well where Eleanor Thompson had hidden her evidence a century earlier, evidence that had waited patiently for the right moment, the right people, to bring it into the light. Like the truth itself, it had never disappeared, only remained hidden until someone with clear eyes and an open heart was ready to see it. With renewed purpose and gratitude, Richard Blackwood walked steadily toward the future, a future forever changed by a child who had seen beyond his wheelchair to the healing that awaited them all.